they do have the right to vote, they just don't have the right to vote while they're in prison. Now the thing is freedoms and rights come with responsibilities. Now if you abuse that responsibility and you actually step on other people's human rights, it's only right that you have your rights took away from you.
MPs overwhelmingly backed a Commons motion to continue denying prisoners the right to vote in defiance of the European Court. The House of Commons voted by 234 to 22, a majority of 212 in favour of the motion tabled by Tory David Davis and Labour's Jack Straw. Mr Davis said convicted prisoners had broken their contract with society, and Mr Straw accused the European Court of going beyond its remit. And that was Paul Houston talking, whose daughter was killed in a hit-and-run accident in 2003. He doesn't see why we should accept the European Court's decision. Well, two men have agreed to go head-to-head tonight with me in the unusual position of being the moderate interlocutor, or moderator, you might say, of the debate. It's Eric Allison, the Guardian's prison correspondent, a former prisoner, and the spirited Tory MP for Romford, Andrew Rosindell, who certainly knows how to fight his corner, with or without his bulldog, which goes around in a Union Jack waistcoat, and with a handsome pair of cojones, as I seem to recall. Andrew and Eric, thanks very much for joining us. Let's start with Andrew, if we may. Andrew, the Tory Labour consensus won the day in the Commons the other night, but was it more about Europe than it was about prisoners?
Well, hello, George. We really miss you in Parliament, you know, because we could have done with you as part of the 234 people in Parliament that voted to stop the prisoners having that vote. And I don't think it was about Europe. It was about making sure that lawbreakers aren't lawmakers. And I think that by not letting them have the vote, it's showing them that, in actual fact, if you break the law, you lose your freedom, and that's what it should be about.
But what about the cost of this to the taxpayer, Andrew? You're a man always on the lookout for any waste of taxpayers' money. When we start compensating these prisoners, as the court will insist that we must, when we start paying fines, all of this is going to look a little different, isn't it?
Well, I hope that Mr Cameron's government will challenge the European courts on this, because at the end of the day, I think we should make our own laws. I don't think at the end of the day we should have these things imposed on us. This is a matter for the British Parliament and British law, not for Europe. And so it is indeed a challenge for the government, and I hope they'll rise to that challenge and ensure that British sovereignty is what decides how we govern our own affairs, and I think that's what most people want.
Let's hear then from Eric Allison, the Guardian's prison correspondent. Eric, you and I have talked about this before. It's a civilised measure, isn't it, to try and help rehabilitate and wean prisoners off the crooked road and back to the straight and narrow?
Absolute civilised measure. It would be harmless and painless. And I'm just so angry about the result of this vote. Not so much about the result itself, because I expected it, but the hypocrisy and cant that came from some of the MPs, including, I'm afraid to say, my opponent this evening, because this was about Europe. There's no question about it was about Europe. It gave the Europhobes the opportunity to express their bias about the convention, and we signed up, I believe, to this convention in the 1940s. Well, you can't join a club and then cherry pick which of the rules you'll abide by and which of the rules you won't abide by. And this blanket ban has been ruled as unlawful. And you're absolutely right. They will have to pay compensation. And then what are they going to say about it? And this coalition, they're so hypocritical. The Lib Dems had in their manifesto. They approved of prisoners getting the vote. Nick Clegg actually repeated that in a televised debate. So that's another thing they've broken their word on.
Who'd have thought it?
Yeah, absolutely. David Cameron or Ken Clarke, they've talked about a rehabilitation revolution. rehabilitating prisoners. What better way to rehabilitate them than to give them some connection with society? And yet they've turned around and they've opposed it en masse. They've shown their true colours. It's an anti-European vote, and they've just used the prisoners as whipping boys.
Andrew,
and they'll pay for it.
Andrew, what do you say to that?
Well, I'm afraid everything I've just heard is just so out of touch with what the British people actually want. You find me a constituent in Romford that actually believes that those who break the law should vote to choose those who make the law. I don't see that that is right. I believe that if you break the law and you're a criminal, you go to jail, you lose your freedom. You regain your freedom once you leave prison. And I don't
lose your freedom, not your human rights, Andrew.
Well,
you lose your freedom. That is the punishment, the loss of liberty.
Anything to do with human rights. This is about prisoners being treated as prisoners and the law-abiding having the right to make their decision about who governs our country. Why should they be allowed to vote when they've broken the law, when they've harmed other people? Why should they then be given the same privileges?
But Andrew,
why should peers who go to prison be allowed to regain their seat in the House of Lords when they come out?
Well, we're changing the subject.
No, we're not changing the subject, because it's one law for the rich and one law. It's one law for the rich and powerful, and one law for the poor.
One rule for the rich and one rule for the poor. That's not what we're talking about this evening. It doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor. If you break the law, you don't vote, and that's the way it should be.
Well, no, he does have a point, Andrew. There's at least 2 peers that I know of that have come out of prison, where they serve substantial... Yeah, but they serve substantial...
George, you should know that peers can't vote anyway.
No, but they can vote to change the law.
They can vote to change the law.
They can do more than vote, Andrew. They can actually make laws. But anyway, we don't want to digress too far on that. Andrew, all of us dislike one law or another. But you would have been one of the people that would say the law is the law is the law. Just because you dislike it doesn't mean you can break it. And we signed up to this European Court. It has already opined, and we are now in breach. Fines and compensation are the inevitable consequence, surely.
Well, you know, George, that I think that most people in this country believe that laws in this country should be made in Britain. I don't object to signing up to international treaties, but at the end of the day, if they're against the interests of our country, we have to review that.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. You've just made the point about the anti-European feeling.
I think that's right.
It's not a question of being anti-European. It's about British laws being made in Britain in the interest of our country. It's not being anti-European. It's actually looking out for what's right for Britain.
Andrew, do you know when the Forfeiture Act came into power, which denied prisoners the vote?
No, tell us, Eric.
1780, 2 years after the last public hanging in this country. That was the mood of, that was the nature of our civilization then.
Oh, don't give Andrew any ideas, for God's sake.
Yes, and by the way, I'm sure that the vast majority of people, or constituents in Romford would bring back hanging if they could as well. MPs are there not to voice in necessarily, public opinion, because otherwise we'd still have capital punishment. MPs are there to, to think rationally and to think above, public opinion sometimes.
But what is rational about allowing convicted criminals, people that some of whom have committed awful crimes against other people, why should they be allowed the same rights?
Andrew, you don't have to give them
the rest of us?
No, Andrew, that's a non sequitur, because you don't have to give those who've committed awful crimes the right to vote. The proposal from the government was to give a limited number of prisoners the right to vote, those sentenced to a relatively short time in prison, which by definition means they didn't commit awful crimes against people.
The European Court only ruled that the blanket ban was unlawful. And by the way, I think we're one of only 2 countries, 2 or 3 other countries in Europe that don't allow prisoners to vote. And we don't see, these countries in disarray because they allow prisoners to vote.
Well,
Andrew, last word to you.
I have to say the argument's been lost, hasn't it? I mean, only 22 MPs voted to allow prisoners the right to vote. I mean, you had Liberals, you had Labour, you had people from the Conservatives and all parties voting against. You only had 22 MPs. I think that's a pretty conclusive result.
It was, no doubt about that. Eric, last word to you, my friend.
Well, it just shows how they toe the line in the anti-European bias, but there you are.
There's a free vote. It's free vote.
Well, you're going to lose because you're going to have to pay compensation to prisoners because there's not a court in the land. And one last word, if I may, Ken Clarke has talked about prisoners working a 40-hour week and paying tax and insurance. Then there's not a court in the land that won't uphold the principle of no taxation without representation. So that's another. A cross you're going to have to bear in the future.
Ken Clarke might be a candidate who gave a good account of himself, I thought, as did Eric Allison, the Guardian's prison correspondent. For me, it's like this. It's hardly worth bothering about. Hardly any prisoners will vote. We don't have to give it to the worst prisoners. We just need to give it to some. Hardly any of them will use it. It will have no impact in electing members of parliament because the votes will be distributed across the country to the last known address of the prisoner in question, virtually none of whom are likely to exercise it. But in denying them it in a blanket fashion, we undoubtedly will end up paying compensation to the very prisoners we're saying we don't want to have the vote, and paying fines to the European Court, which we signed up to, Solomon binding, my lud, decades and decades ago, and have continued to be a member of through governments of every political stripe. For me, this was really, for many, about Europe. We have a class of people in this country and a class of parliamentarian that cannot accept that Britain is a European country, that bucolically bellows at Johnny Foreigner over the channel at every opportunity they get. And I'm sure that they were there in numbers in the House of Commons in the week. But what do you think? 08717 2233 44 is the number to call. If you have a different point of view to me, then your call is particularly welcome. You can call me about prisoners' rights